Somewhere at the top of the world, past every people the Greeks had ever met, there was supposedly a place where nobody got sick, nobody grew old, and the sun barely set. The Greeks called it Hyperborea, and for 5 centuries their greatest poets, historians, and geographers couldn't stop arguing about it. What makes this legend so strange isn't the paradise itself, since every ancient culture had one or two of those. It's that the Greeks kept trying to map it, and they treated Hyperborea not as myth, but as a geographical problem, a real location they just hadn't reached yet. In trying to pin it down, they revealed far more about themselves than they ever did about the frozen north. The word Hyperborea translates fairly directly. Boreas was the Greek god of the north wind, and hyper means beyond. So Hyperborea was simply the land beyond the north wind, a place so far north that even Boreas couldn't reach it. The logic had an odd elegance to it. Because the cold northern winds couldn't penetrate Hyperborea, the land enjoyed a perpetual mild climate. The earliest references to this far northern place are frustratingly vague. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, claimed that both Hesiod and Homer had mentioned the Hyperboreans. He noted that Homer's supposed reference came from a lost poem called the Epigony, and Herodotus himself wasn't convinced Homer had actually written it. By the time anyone was writing detailed accounts of Hyperborea, the concept already felt ancient. It seemed to have always been there, floating at the edges of Greek geographical knowledge, never quite coming into focus. The first person who reportedly tried to bring it into focus was Aristeas of Proconnesus, a perhaps legendary traveler who was active around the 7th century BC. Aristeas composed an epic called the Arimaspeia, which described his claimed journey into the far north. According to his account, he'd traveled to the land of the Isidones, a people living somewhere in Central Asia, and they'd told him about the lands beyond their own borders. The geography he laid out was essentially a layered map of the north. First there was Isidones, then the one-eyed Arimaspians who fought gold-guarding griffins, then finally the Hyperboreans and the great ocean at the edge of the world. The Arimaspeia didn't survive intact, but its fragments were widely cited, and it served as the primary Greek source on the peoples of the far north. The poem also made a claim central to the Hyperborea legend, that Apollo spent his winters among the Hyperboreans. The god of light, music, and prophecy lived with them for part of every year when his summer abode became too cold. The most vivid surviving description of Hyperborea from the ancient world comes from the poet Pindar, who wrote his 10th Pythian ode around 498 BC. In it, he told the story of Perseus traveling to the land of the Hyperboreans, and what he described there was unlike anything else in Greek literature. Pindar described a semi-immortal people who lived entirely without work, disease, or fear of divine punishment. Their days were filled with feasting, music, and the worship of Apollo, who brought them gifts from the gods every year. When Perseus arrived, he found that the entire society was completely dedicated to this patron deity. Notably, while the Hyperboreans recognized this powerful and influential Greek god, aside from rituals to Apollo, nothing about them seemed Greek at all. They weren't an outpost of Greek culture at the top of the world, but instead, something entirely different. Pindar also made a point that would echo through later accounts. You couldn't actually get to Hyperborea. Neither by ship nor on foot, he wrote, could anyone find the road to their gathering place. It was beyond the reach of ordinary mortals, and only a figure like Perseus, the semi-divine hero and a son of Zeus, could cross that boundary. This idea that Hyperborea existed in a space that was geographically real but physically inaccessible was a tension the Greeks never fully resolved. About 50 years after Pindar, Herodotus took up the question of Hyperborea in Book 4 of his Histories, and his treatment was markedly different. Herodotus was uncharacteristically skeptical about the claims of this northern land, at least to an extent. He said he couldn't find anyone who claimed first-hand knowledge of the lands beyond the far north, and he noted that even Aristeas hadn't claimed to have visited the location. Aristeas had only gone as far as the Isidones and was reporting what they'd told him about the peoples further on. But Herodotus didn't dismiss the Hyperboreans entirely, because he had something more interesting than travelers' tales to work with. He had physical evidence, or at least a ritual chain of custody that implied physical evidence. He described in detail a practice by which sacred offerings from the Hyperboreans were transported to the island of Delos, Apollo's sacred birthplace. According to Herodotus, these offerings were wrapped in wheat straw and passed from people to people in a relay across the ancient world. They'd travel from the Hyperboreans to the Scythians, then westward from nation to nation until they reached the Adriatic, where they were then sent to the Temple of Apollo. This wasn't something Herodotus was speculating about, and he claimed he was describing an active ritual practice that the Delians themselves told him about. Herodotus recorded that originally, the Hyperboreans had sent 2 young women to deliver the gifts in person, accompanied by 5 male guards. The delegation, however, didn't return, and after that, the Hyperboreans changed their approach and adopted the relay system. They passed the offerings to their neighbors, trusting each successive people to forward them along. For all his skepticism, Herodotus acknowledged that the story of the offerings was widely believed and well attested. He accepted the possibility that it could be a real place, but overall he seems to have believed the offerings originally came from somewhere in Central Asia. Hecataeus of Abdera, a Greek historian working around 300 BC, compiled all the existing stories about the Hyperboreans into a lengthy treatise. That treatise is now lost, but substantial portions of it were preserved by Diodorus Siculus, who was writing his Universal History in the 1st century BC. The version Diodorus recorded, drawing on Hecataeus, placed Hyperborea on a large fertile island in the ocean beyond the land of the Celts. The island reportedly enjoyed a climate so mild that it produced 2 harvests every year. He confirmed that its inhabitants worshipped Apollo above all other gods, and the entire island was essentially a sacred precinct dedicated to him. Diodorus described the Hyperboreans as a nation of musicians who sang hymns to Apollo continuously and played the lyre with great skill. According to Diodorus, Hecataeus described a great circular temple on the island, dedicated to, you guessed it, Apollo. The temple was circular or spherical in shape and enormous in scale, likely much larger than anything in the known world. Hecataeus also introduced an odd astronomical detail that fascinated ancient scientists and historians alike. He claimed that from this island, the moon appeared to hang remarkably close to the Earth, and that observable features on its surface could be seen. He also claimed that Apollo only visited the island every 19 years, but he squared this with the previous legend. This is a period that corresponds to the Metonic cycle, the roughly 19-year period, after which the phases of the moon recur on the same days of the solar year. This again fascinated the ancients, and some modern scholars have speculated that the ancient Greeks believed this was why the Hyperboreans didn't appear to age. In this telling, they were essentially aging on a 19-year scale, meaning a Hyperborean lifespan would be counted in the thousands of years. Across every version of the Hyperborea tradition, from Aristeas through Pindar through Herodotus through Hecataeus, one element remains absolutely constant. Hyperborea was Apollo's paradise on Earth, and the residents worshipped him with a fervor matched by no other people. The Greeks were saying that one of their most important gods had a second home among a distant, blessed people. They also claimed that those people sent tribute to the Greek world, acknowledging the shared bond. Hyperborea served as proof that Apollo's reach extended to the very edges of the known world and beyond. It was, in essence, a theological and geographic claim about the nature and power of the Hellenic gods. But the tradition also reflected something about how the Greeks understood the limits of their own civilization. Hyperborea was everything Greece aspired to be but couldn't quite manage. A society without war, without disease, without the corruptions of age and politics. It was the ideal push to the farthest point on the map, always one horizon beyond reach, a place to which the Greeks had a small physical connection, but could never visit. Perhaps Hyperborea endured in the Greek imagination precisely because it couldn't be verified. Every generation could project its own longings onto that blank space beyond the north wind, and no traveler would ever come back to say they'd got it wrong. The offerings kept arriving on Delos, wrapped in straw, passed hand to hand across an entire continent. Nobody could say for certain where they'd started, and it was a mystery the ancient world was surprisingly content to leave unsolved. Now, no segment on this northern island would be complete without mentioning perhaps the most famous theory on where it actually was. This enduring modern theory places Hyperborea in the British Isles, based largely on later classical descriptions. In particular, Diodorus Siculus described a large northern island beyond the Celts, with a mild climate, fertile land, and a circular temple to Apollo. Some modern interpreters connect this to Britain, especially sites like Stonehenge, whose circular form loosely echoes the temple mentioned in ancient accounts. The Isles also fit geographically with a distant northwestern land, known but not fully explored by Greeks. However, this identification is very much speculative, and earlier writers like Herodotus placed Hyperborea far beyond known peoples, often toward Central Asia. The offerings to Delos also appear to have come from Central Asia as well, not in the direction of the British Isles. Sometime around 1392, one of the most powerful men in the world became convinced that his body was made of glass. Charles VI of France, a king who commanded armies and ruled over millions, reportedly had iron rods sewn into his clothing and refused to let people near him. He was genuinely terrified that the slightest contact would shatter him into pieces. It was just one feature of a mental deterioration that stretched across 3 decades, leaving France effectively leaderless during one of the most turbulent periods in its history. And Charles wasn't even the only case. He was just the most powerful person to suffer from what physicians of the time recognized as a genuine medical condition. They called it the glass delusion, and at its peak, it spread across the elite of the continent with a persistence that bordered on epidemic. The dominant medical framework, inherited from the Greek physician Galen and from Hippocrates before him, held that the body was governed by 4 humors. Health meant keeping them balanced, and when they fell out of balance, illness followed. And the nature of the illness depended on which humor had gone wrong. An excess of black bile produced a condition called melancholia, but this wasn't just sadness in the way we'd think of it. Melancholia was a broad category of mental disturbance that could look like almost anything. Some melancholics became convinced they were animals, while others believed they were cursed. Some also came to believe, with total conviction, that their bodies had transformed into glass, despite all physical evidence to the contrary. Despite this, though, the reasoning within the humoral system wasn't actually unreasonable. Black bile was classified as cold and dry, and physicians theorized that in the heat of the body, an excess of black bile took on what they described as a glassy quality. If the bile itself had become glass-like, the thinking went, it wasn't so strange that the sufferer's mind would interpret the body as having become glass too. The cold, dry properties of the humor produced a brittleness that the imagination then made literal. In a medical culture where the boundary between the physical and the psychological was non-existent, this made a kind of internal sense. The glass delusion wasn't treated as folklore or superstition by the physicians who encountered it, perhaps because of who it was affecting. It attracted serious clinical attention from some of the most prominent medical minds of the period. André du Laurent, personal physician to Henry IV of France in the late 16th century, described multiple cases in his treatise on diseases of melancholy. One of his patients, a nobleman, had become convinced that his body was shaped like a glass pitcher. The man reportedly slept buried in straw, terrified that he might tip over in the night and pour himself out across the floor. Another of his patients believed specifically that his feet were made of glass and refused to walk, afraid that each step would crack and destroy them. Alfonso de Santa Cruz, a physician at the Spanish royal court, documented remarkably similar cases in his own medical writings. He independently described the same pitcher delusion, which suggests either that the two were aware of the same patient or that the delusion manifested yet again. Notably, the symptoms for the delusion were remarkably uniform. Patients refused to sit on hard surfaces, begged visitors to keep their distance, and lived in constant paralyzing fear. They generally wrapped themselves in heavy blankets, but not just to prevent shattering, as you may think. They were also extremely concerned that observers could view their interiors, since they genuinely believed that they were see-through. The Italian scholar Tommaso Garzoni, writing in the 1580s, cataloged the glass delusion in his encyclopedic survey of human conditions. He treated it as one of many possible expressions of disordered reason, notable for how specific it was, but not fundamentally different from a man who believed he was a wolf. For Garzoni, these were all branches of the same disease tree, all rooted in humoral imbalance, and all worthy of medical, not spiritual, intervention. The question of why glass in particular became such a focus of the delusion is something that we modern people ask without understanding the medieval significance of glass. Glass held a position in the late medieval imagination that no other material occupied. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Venetian glassmakers had perfected techniques for producing glass of extraordinary clarity and thinness. Glass objects were filtering into aristocratic households across Europe, prized for their beauty, but defined by their fragility. For a culture that associated glass with refinement and breakability, the leap to imagining one's own body as glass wasn't as absurd as it sounds. Several physicians of the period noted that the glass delusion seemed to afflict the educated and the wealthy far more often than common people. Some have speculated that this is because peasants were, in essence, not familiar with fine glass in a day-to-day setting. They couldn't touch it or interact with it in the way a nobleman or a noblewoman could, and they may not know its properties. Notably, Miguel de Cervantes captured the condition in his 1613 novella about a young law student who becomes convinced he's made of glass after being poisoned. The character insists that because he's glass, his perceptions are clearer than those of ordinary men of flesh. It was fiction, of course, but Cervantes was drawing from a medical reality his readers would have recognized immediately. The glass delusion wasn't obscure by the early 17th century, since it was common enough to serve as the premise of a story without requiring explanation. Medieval and early modern physicians didn't simply document the glass delusion and move on. They attempted to treat it, and their methods, while grounded in humoral theory, reflected a surprisingly patient and humane approach. Some accounts describe physicians deliberately dropping glass objects near their patients so the sufferer could watch glass shatter while their own body remained intact. This is remarkably similar to modern exposure therapy, wherein there is a gradual confrontation of the fear. Others prescribe dietary changes aimed at rebalancing the humors, reducing cold and dry foods in favor of warm and moist ones to counteract the excess black bile. Music, gentle conversation, and carefully managed exercise were also recommended as ways to draw the melancholic mind away from its fixation. The medical literature was candid about the difficulty of treating the glass delusion, but the treatments reveal something important about how the condition was understood. Physicians didn't assign blame. Instead, they treated it as illness, rooted in the body's constitution, and approached it with patience and whatever medical knowledge they had. The sufferers were treated as being sick people, not bad people, or people who deserved ridicule for their delusional belief. Ultimately, the glass delusion faded from medical literature by the late 17th century. For reasons that remain unknown, despite hundreds of years of precedent, people virtually stopped believing that their bodies were made of glass around this time. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy coming in with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget that you can join up on the YouTube membership or the Patreon to take your support for my content to the next level. Now with that said, let's get back to the historical mysteries, since we've still got a lot of ground to cover. For over 1,000 years, no army on earth managed to breach the walls of Constantinople. Not the Persians, not the Arabs, not the Bulgars, and not the Viking raiders that plagued the city. Empires rose and crumbled, plagues swept continents, entire civilizations blinked out of existence, and still those walls held. By the spring of 1453, they'd been standing for more than a millennium. The walls were a double ring of limestone and brick stretching 4 miles across the only land approach to the city, fronted by a 60-foot moat. Armies had thrown themselves at those walls for centuries and walked away, beaten. So when a 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan decided he was going to be the one to finally take Constantinople, most of the known world had good reason to think he was out of his mind. At its height under Justinian in the 6th century, Constantinople was the largest and wealthiest city in the Christian world, home to perhaps 500,000 people. It was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call Byzantium, and it sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It controlled the narrow strait of the Bosphorus and the shipping lanes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and for centuries, it was the richest prize in the world. But by the 15th century, the empire had been slowly bleeding out for centuries. The catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204, when fellow Christians sacked the city and carved up Byzantine territory, dealt a wound from which Byzantium never fully recovered. By the time Constantine XI Palaiologos took the throne in 1449, the so-called empire consisted of Constantinople itself, a few scraps of the Peloponnese, and not much else. The city's population had collapsed to somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people. Entire neighborhoods lay abandoned, with farms and orchards growing inside the walls where houses once stood. Constantine knew what was coming, since the Ottoman Turks had already swallowed almost everything around him. His appeals to Western Europe for military aid produced sympathy, promises, and almost nothing of practical value. Pope Nicholas V tried to rally support, but Western Europe was fractured by its own conflicts and internal politics. The old wound of the Great Schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches didn't help. Many ordinary Byzantines were deeply hostile to any deal with Rome or with Western Europeans in general. The Genoese and the Venetians had offered to help over the previous centuries, but simply ended up behaving more like vultures, tearing strips off the rotting imperial carcass. However, as you'll see, the Genoese did valiantly take part in the last stand against the Ottomans, attempting to come through in the 11th hour. Mehmed II became sultan for the second time in 1451 at the age of 19, and let's just say he was ambitious. His father Murad II had briefly abdicated in Mehmed's favor once before, only to take the throne back when the boy proved unable to manage the empire's politics. That humiliation burned in him, and when Murad passed away and Mehmed reclaimed the sultanate, he was determined to prove himself. He spent the better part of 2 years preparing for what would come next. In 1452, he built the fortress of Rumeli Hisari on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an older Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. This effectively choked off the strait and cut Constantinople's access to the Black Sea, and it sent an unmistakable message. He also commissioned what was reportedly the largest cannon ever built at that time. A Hungarian engineer named Orban had first offered his services to Constantine XI, who couldn't afford him. Mehmed could, and the resulting weapon, sometimes called the Great Bombard, was roughly 27 feet long. It was capable of hurling stone balls weighing around 600 pounds over a mile. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to move, and it could reportedly only manage a handful of shots per day because it needed hours to cool between firings. But when it hit the ancient Theodosian walls, which weren't designed with giant artillery pieces in mind, the effect was devastating. The siege began on April 6, 1453, and Mehmed arrived with an army that contemporary sources estimated at anywhere from 60,000 to over 100,000 troops. Against this, Constantine XI had somewhere around 7,000 defenders, including roughly 700 Genoese soldiers under a skilled commander named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. The arithmetic was horrifying, but the defenders had significant advantages, even beyond the usual siege advantage. The Theodosian walls were still the most formidable fortifications ever built, even after 1,000 years, and even after the invention of modern artillery. The city was surrounded by water on 3 sides, with a massive chain stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn to block enemy ships. The defenders, for their part, also fought with the desperate energy of people who knew there was nowhere to retreat. For weeks, Mehmed hammered the walls with his cannons. The Great Bombard and dozens of smaller guns pounded the fortifications day after day, opening breaches that the defenders would frantically repair overnight. Ottoman assault waves crashed against the walls repeatedly and were thrown back every time. Giustiniani proved to be a superb tactical commander, racing along the walls to reinforce wherever the fighting was thickest. The Ottomans also tried tunneling under the walls, but a Scottish engineer in Byzantine service named John Grant detected the mines and flooded or collapsed most of them. On April 20th, 4 ships, 3 Genoese vessels, and 1 Byzantine transport loaded with grain fought their way past the Ottoman fleet and into the harbor. It was a small victory, and it gave the defenders hope that more help from the west might follow. Then Mehmed did something that still seems barely believable. The chain across the Golden Horn was preventing his fleet from entering the harbor and attacking the city's weaker sea walls. Most commanders would have tried to break or circumvent the chain directly. Mehmed instead ordered roughly 70 ships hauled overland on greased wooden tracks up and over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Galata. They then went down into the Golden Horn on the other side of the chain. It's the kind of maneuver that sounds like something from a myth, but multiple independent sources from both sides confirm it happened. It worked, and the defenders, already stretched impossibly thin, now had to garrison the harbor walls as well. By late May, both sides were exhausted, and Mehmed's own council reportedly included advisors who urged him to negotiate or withdraw. They argued that a prolonged siege was draining resources and that a relief fleet from Venice might arrive at any time. Mehmed overruled them, and he ordered a final assault for the morning of May 29th, 1453, and that would be the last day in history where Roman citizens would wake up to a Roman dawn. The attack came in waves, beginning in the early hours before dawn. Mehmed sent his least experienced troops first, irregulars and conscripts whose job was essentially to tire out the defenders before the elite units arrived. For hours, the defenders fought them off, but then came the Anatolian regulars, and the fighting grew fiercer. The walls were breached in several places, but the defenders kept sealing the gaps. Two things then happened in quick succession that decided the fate of the city. First, Giovanni Giustiniani took a serious wound, either from a crossbow bolt or a small cannonball that pierced his breastplate. He asked to be carried to a ship, and while Constantine reportedly begged him to stay, Giustiniani was evacuated through one of the city gates. When the Genoese defenders saw their commander being carried away, many of them broke and followed him toward the harbor. With the Genoese leaving, panic spread along the wall almost instantly. Around the same time, a small group of Ottoman soldiers discovered that a minor gate in the walls, known as the Kirka Porta, had been left unlocked or incompletely sealed. Some have even suggested that the gate was intentionally left unlocked by someone inside the city, though ultimately there's no proof that this ever happened. They pushed through and raised the Ottoman banner on the inner wall, and the sight of enemy flags behind the defenses spread panic through the remaining defenders. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, reportedly threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting. He was never seen again, and the Byzantine historian George Safrances, who had been a close friend, later wrote that the emperor's body was never positively identified. Legend says that he perished fighting alongside his men in a heroic last stand, and honestly, it appears to be true. Mehmed entered the city later that day. He was 21 years old, and he'd just accomplished what generations of predecessors could not. By long-standing custom, his troops were permitted to loot for 3 days, and they did so thoroughly. Several later historians claim that Mehmed walked through the ruined imperial palace and was moved by its emptiness. He reportedly murmured verses from a Persian poem about the impermanence of worldly glory. Whether that anecdote is true or embellished by later chroniclers, it's persisted for a reason. The fall of Constantinople closed the last chapter on the Eastern Roman Empire, a political entity that traced its unbroken lineage back to Romulus and the Roman kingdom. Going by the traditional founding of the Roman kingdom, this was a period of exactly 2,205 years between the founding and the fall of the last direct vestige of the Roman Empire. Now, I know someone in the comments will mention the Empire of Trebizond or any number of other candidates, but the fall of Constantinople marked the end of an era. Scholars fled westward carrying manuscripts and knowledge that would help fuel the Italian Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire, for its part, gained a capital it would hold for nearly 500 more years, and the Greco-Roman nature of the city would gradually change over time. Trade routes shifted, and within decades, European powers were investing heavily in finding sea routes to Asia that didn't pass through Ottoman territory. That search would eventually lead to the voyages of Columbus and da Gama, reshaping the world in ways that no one standing on those broken walls in the spring of 1453 could imagine. Interestingly, Constantinople didn't fall because its defenders were cowards. In fact, as I've explained, it was quite the opposite. They held for 53 days against impossible odds, outnumbered by as much as 10 to 1, and many of them perished on the walls rather than surrender. The last Roman emperor himself almost certainly joined the fray, heroically perishing alongside his soldiers. Constantine, in essence, went out in a way that would have filled Livy with unbridled Roman pride, and personally, I find that both poetic and bittersweet. In the end, Constantinople fell because the empire had been running on fumes for centuries, and still, despite that, the Romans gave one of the most heroic last stands in history. Imagine waking up to the revelation that you're not in the 21st century, but actually in 1729. More bizarre still is that this doesn't require any sci-fi plot or fantasy elements. 3 whole centuries of history were supposedly made up and never occurred. This wild scenario is exactly what the phantom time hypothesis proposes. It's a conspiracy theory suggesting that nearly 300 years of the early Middle Ages were inserted into the calendar by ambitious rulers and filled with fake history. The phantom time hypothesis is a pseudo-historical theory first put forward in the 1990s by a German historian named Herbert Illig. According to Illig, the period between 614 and 911 never truly happened, but rather they were fabricated. In Illig's version of history, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II conspired to rewrite the calendar. They supposedly wanted to place themselves at the prestigious year AD 1000, believing it to be a millennial milestone with great Christian significance. To achieve this, the theory claims, these leaders added 297 years to history, adjusting dates and events so that their own reigns would include the magic year 1000. In this bizarre alternate timeline, entire chapters of medieval history were allegedly invented out of whole cloth. For example, Charlemagne, the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, would never have existed, and the state he supposedly founded would be nothing more than an invention. Likewise, the Viking raids on England and even entire dynasties such as China's Tang dynasty would be misdated or completely made up. In short, Illig argued that nearly 3 centuries worth of events across Europe and beyond were forged after the fact, creating a phantom period of history. Illig and his supporters pointed to a few historical oddities which they believed hinted that something was wrong with the accepted timeline. One major point was the scarcity of documentary and archaeological evidence in Western Europe for the 7th to 9th centuries. He pointed out that relatively few chronicles or original records survive from that period, a fact he found highly suspicious. To him, this void in the historical record suggested that the era might have been concocted later to fill a gap. Illig also claimed that some buildings dated to the 10th century had surprisingly Roman-like design elements that seemed out of place for the era. He took this as another sign that the timeline of the Roman Empire and its aftermath had been distorted. According to him, medieval builders were closer in time to ancient Rome than conventional history admits. The most famous evidence Illig cited was a calendar quirk. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII's reform of the Julian calendar dropped 10 days to realign with the seasons. Illig argued that if the Julian calendar had truly been running since 45 BC, it should have been off by about 13 days by 1582, not just 10. And funny enough, his math on this was correct, but there was a problem with his reasoning that I'll address in a moment. To him, this hinted that roughly 3 centuries worth of days had never actually passed at all. To achieve this goal, the story imagines that Otto, Sylvester, and their allies ordered monks and scribes to manufacture documents, chronicles, and artifacts for the phantom years. Fake battles, phony royal lineages, and forged charters would have been planted in libraries and archives, tricking future historians. It's an incredibly elaborate notion. A handful of men in the early medieval era supposedly managed to fool the world by inserting a phantom era into our history books. But this, of course, is the major flaw in Illig's theory, the massive scale of the alleged forgery. If the years 614 to 911 AD were invented, it's not only European history that must be falsified, but also the histories of multiple civilizations. During those centuries, the Byzantine Empire and the emerging Caliphate were locked in conflicts, and Tang Dynasty China experienced a golden age of art and science. These were all recorded in detail, and these records around the world line up with our current calendar. For phantom time to be real, virtually every scholar and record keeper from Europe to Asia would have to be complicit in the same lie, an almost impossible scenario. Even within Europe alone, the hoax would have to be astonishingly thorough. Think of the countless artifacts, manuscripts, inscriptions, and coins dated to the early Middle Ages. All of them would need to be misdated or forged to fool later historians. Yet archaeologists have unearthed many such items, and their dating fits neatly into the expected timeline. Numerous monastic records, legal documents, and chronicles from Europe's 7th to 10th centuries survive and dovetail with events before and after. Fabricating 3 centuries of such widely attested history without leaving glaring inconsistencies would perhaps be the most audacious undertaking in human history. If hundreds of years were missing, we would also expect to see clues in nature or science, but we don't. Dendrochronology, the dating of wood by tree rings, provides continuous year-by-year timelines stretching well before the 7th century, and it shows no gaps or jumps in sequence. Likewise, historical astronomy serves as a check on chronology. Ancient and medieval observers around the world recorded celestial events that match our timeline. For example, Roman writings note a solar eclipse in 59 AD that astronomers today can pinpoint to that same year. If nearly 3 extra centuries had been inserted into history, those recorded eclipses and appearances of Halley's Comet would be shifted and inconsistent. Finally, the calendar oddity Illig emphasized has a simple explanation. The Gregorian reform of 1582 dropped 10 days not to correct back to Julius Caesar's time, but to realign with the Council of Nicaea in 325. By 1582, about 1,257 years had passed since 325, which corresponds to a 10-day drift, roughly 1 day per 128 years. The Church was resetting the calendar to where it had been in 325, so a 10-day correction was exactly what was needed, with no mysterious missing centuries required. When all is said and done, the phantom time hypothesis is a fascinating thought experiment, but not a serious account of history. Mainstream historians and archaeologists universally reject the idea that the early Middle Ages were an elaborate hoax. There is simply too much evidence that those centuries did occur and were filled with real people, conflicts, and cultural shifts. While it's true that historical records around the 7th to 9th centuries in Europe are relatively sparse, this was due to Europe being at a low point economically.